May 1943, Eastern Atlantic, 16:42 hours. The patrol aircraft flew low enough that the crew could see the texture of the ocean. From altitude, the Atlantic often looked like a single endless surface, but at low level, sunlight cut through the water at angles that revealed details, currents shifting beneath the waves, darker patches of depth, and sometimes shapes that did not belong there. The bomber had been in the air for nearly 3 hours. Its mission was routine: sweep a long stretch of shipping lane where Allied convoys had recently reported submarine activity. The crew had already checked several empty sectors, scanning carefully for wakes, periscopes, or oil streaks. Most patrols ended without contact. That afternoon almost did. The aircraft's observer was leaning against the side window, scanning the water below through binoculars. Then he lowered them suddenly. "Pilot, hold course." The pilot glanced back briefly. "What is it?" The observer pointed down through the glass. At first, the water looked normal, sunlight reflecting in shifting silver patterns across the surface. But then the shadow moved. It was subtle. A darker shape beneath the surface, long and narrow, sliding slowly through the water like a ghost. Submarines often believed they were safe when running just below the surface, especially in clear daylight. From ships above, a submerged hull could be difficult to detect. But from an aircraft looking down into the water, the angle sometimes revealed everything. The observer leaned closer. "That's a boat." The pilot banked slightly, bringing the aircraft directly over the shadow. Now the outline became unmistakable. A submarine running shallow, probably attempting to avoid radar detection while still conserving battery power. The submarine crew likely believed they were invisible. But the aircraft had the advantage of perspective. From above, the ocean had turned transparent. "Depth charges ready," the bombardier called from the rear. The pilot pushed the aircraft lower. There was no need to circle or confirm. In anti-submarine warfare, hesitation often meant losing the target entirely. If the submarine realized it had been spotted, it could dive deeper within seconds. The shadow beneath the water continued moving slowly, unaware of what was descending toward it. At 16:44 hours, the pilot aligned the aircraft directly over the shape. The bombardier opened the release. 4 depth charges dropped into the Atlantic in quick succession. From the aircraft, the crew watched the dark shadow vanish deeper beneath the surface. Seconds later, the ocean erupted. The first explosion shattered the calm surface of the Atlantic. From the aircraft above, the crew saw a towering column of water erupt where the first depth charge detonated. A second blast followed immediately, then a third, each concussion sending white foam and dark spray high into the air. The sea that had been smooth only seconds earlier now boiled with turbulence. The pilot pulled the aircraft slightly upward, circling the explosion pattern while the crew watched carefully. If the charges had landed close enough, the submarine below would feel the pressure waves like massive underwater hammer blows. But the aircraft crew could not see the submarine anymore. The shadow had vanished the moment the depth charges struck the water. Below the surface, the situation was far more violent. Inside the submarine, the crew had only seconds of warning. One of the lookouts had glimpsed the aircraft just before it crossed overhead, and the alarm had already begun echoing through the boat. "Aircraft dive." Ballast tanks flooded rapidly as the submarine attempted to descend deeper. But the depth charges were already falling. The first explosion struck above and slightly behind the submarine. The pressure wave rolled downward through the water, slamming against the steel hull with brutal force. Inside the control room, lights flickered violently. Tools rattled off shelves. Crewmen grabbed railings to keep their footing as the submarine lurched from the shockwave. Then the second explosion came closer. The hull vibrated with a deep metallic groan as the pressure pulse passed through the submarine. One gauge shattered instantly, glass scattering across the deck. The third blast struck almost directly above the boat. The entire submarine seemed to shudder as if struck by an enormous hammer. A pipe seam burst somewhere in the forward compartment, spraying a thin line of seawater into the air. Depth: 40 meters, diving. The commander forced the boat deeper, hopping to escape the center of the attack pattern before the final detonation. The fourth depth charge exploded seconds later. For a moment, the ocean around the submarine became a cage of pressure waves and violent currents. The hull creaked under the strain as the shock passed through the water. Then suddenly, the explosions stopped. Inside the submarine, the crew waited tensely. Because in anti-submarine warfare, the first attack rarely ends the hunt. Above the surface, the patrol plane was already circling again, and the crew was watching the water closely for the one sign that would confirm whether their attack had worked. Oil, bubbles, or movement beneath the surface. The patrol aircraft circled slowly above the disturbed water. From the cockpit, the pilot kept the aircraft in a wide orbit, while the observer and bombardier leaned over the side windows, scanning the ocean carefully. After a depth charge attack, the sea often revealed clues. Oil streaks meant the hull had been breached. Floating debris suggested structural damage. A long trail of bubbles could indicate a submarine descending rapidly or releasing compressed air. For several seconds, the ocean showed nothing. Just white foam spreading outward from the explosions. Then the observer spoke quietly. Bubbles, slight movement. The pilot banked lower. From above, the disturbance was faint but visible. A narrow ribbon of bubbles drifted across the surface, moving slowly with the current. That meant the submarine had survived the first attack. And it was still moving. Inside the aircraft, the crew prepared immediately for another run. Depth charges were limited, but losing contact entirely would be worse. A submarine that escaped could disappear into the vast Atlantic within minutes. The bombardier armed the next set of charges. Meanwhile, far below the surface, the submarine struggled to recover from the blast pattern. The commander gripped the edge of the chart table as the hull continued to vibrate slightly from the pressure waves. Report. A petty officer stepped forward quickly. Minor leak forward compartment sealed, one damaged gauge, no major flooding. The commander nodded once. They had survived the first pattern. But survival did not mean safety. The hydrophone operator raised a hand suddenly. Aircraft engines circling overhead. The commander closed his eyes briefly. The aircraft had seen something, which meant the attack was not over. Course change, slow speed. The submarine began turning gradually beneath the water, attempting to slip away from the original explosion point. Electric motors hummed softly, pushing the boat forward with careful restraint. Too much speed would create noise. Too little movement would leave them directly under the next attack. Above the ocean, the patrol aircraft had already begun descending again. The pilot lined up the next attack run carefully, following the drifting bubble trail toward its origin point. The submarine crew below could not see the aircraft, but the hydrophone operator heard the change in engine tone. The aircraft was descending. Then he whispered the word every submariner feared. Approaching. Moments later, the bombardier opened the release again. And once more, the ocean began to explode. Inside the submarine, the warning came seconds before the attack. The hydrophone operator had already identified the change in engine pitch above them. Aircraft engines sounded different when descending for an attack run, louder, sharper, and closing quickly. Then came the word. Falling. Depth charges were already in the water. The commander reacted instantly. Hard port rudder, dive deeper. Ballast tanks filled as the submarine angled downward into darker water. The electric motors pushed harder now, sacrificing silence for survival. Depth gauges moved quickly. 60 meters, 70. The first explosion came before the submarine reached 80. The blast slammed into the hull with a violent metallic crack. The pressure wave rolled through the boat like thunder inside steel walls. Crewmen grabbed pipes and railings as the deck tilted under their boots. Then the second charge detonated. This one was closer. Lights flickered violently again. One of the overhead bulbs burst with a sharp pop, plunging part of the control room into red emergency lighting. The submarine groaned as the hull flexed slightly under the shockwave. Depth. 90 meters. The commander nodded grimly. Depth charges were designed to explode at specific depths, but aircraft crews could only estimate the submarine's position. If the estimate was wrong by even a small margin, the blast would miss its lethal range. Luck mattered. The third explosion rolled through the water moments later. This time the shockwave struck slightly forward, throwing several men off balance. A wrench slid across the deck plates and struck the bulkhead with a sharp metallic clang. But the hull held. The final depth charge detonated seconds later, farther away. The pressure wave passed through the submarine like a distant thunderclap. Then silence. Inside the boat, no one moved for several seconds. The commander listened carefully. No new explosions followed. Above them, the patrol bomber climbed slowly back toward its circling altitude. The ocean surface still churned from the blast pattern, but the aircraft crew could not see what was happening below. From the cockpit, the pilots scanned the water carefully. If the attack had struck the submarine directly, oil would soon appear on the surface. If not, the submarine might still be alive beneath the waves. Inside the submarine, the crew waited in tense silence. Because if the aircraft still believed the submarine was below, another attack run could come at any moment. For several minutes, nothing happened. Inside the submarine, that silence felt heavier than the explosions. The crew remained exactly where they were, listening to the faint sounds of the ocean through the hull. Electric motors turned slowly, pushing the boat forward at barely more than a crawl. The commander had ordered silent running. No unnecessary movement. No loose equipment. No voices above a whisper. Even the smallest sound could carry through water and reveal their position to the aircraft above. The hydrophone operator adjusted his headphones carefully. At first, the only sound he heard was the quiet hum of the submarine's own motors. Then slowly, another sound appeared. Aircraft engines. Still overhead. The bomber had not left. Above the Atlantic, the patrol plane continued circling patiently. From the air, the pilot could see the wide circle of disturbed water left by the previous explosions. But the submarine itself was invisible. That did not mean it had escaped. Experienced anti-submarine crews knew that a submarine forced deep by depth charges often moved slowly away from the original attack point. If the aircraft remained nearby long enough, the submarine might surface again later to recharge batteries. So the aircraft stayed. Inside the submarine, the commander considered his options. Remaining deep consumed battery power rapidly. Without diesel engines running, the boat could only rely on its electric motors. Eventually, those batteries would drain. But surfacing too soon would place the submarine directly under the aircraft. For now, there was only one choice. Wait. Minutes passed slowly. The submarine crept forward through dark water, trying to slip away from the original dive point without creating detectable noise. "Depth?" the commander asked quietly. 100 meters. The hull creaked faintly as pressure pushed against the steel. The crew had experienced depth charge attacks before. They understood that survival often depended on patience rather than speed. Above them, the bomber continued searching. But the Atlantic was vast, and even careful observation could only reveal so much. Eventually, fuel would force the aircraft to return to base. The hydrophone operator listened carefully again. After a few seconds, he spoke. "Engines moving away." The sound was faint but unmistakable. The patrol aircraft was leaving the area. Inside the submarine, several crewmen exhaled quietly. But the commander did not relax yet. Aircraft sometimes circled back unexpectedly, and the ocean above them was still the same place where explosions had shaken their boat only minutes earlier. For now, the submarine would remain deep. Because in the Atlantic War, survival often meant waiting longer than the hunter expected. The submarine remained deep for nearly 30 minutes. Inside the control room, the tension slowly shifted from fear to exhaustion. The crew had already endured 2 depth charge patterns, and every man aboard knew how quickly another aircraft could appear. The commander refused to rush the decision. "Hydrophones." The operator listened again, adjusting the sensitive equipment carefully. "Nothing. No aircraft engines. No distant propellers. Only the quiet sound of moving water around the hull." That silence meant the patrol plane had likely returned toward its base. But even then, surfacing immediately would be dangerous. Allied patrol routes overlapped frequently, and another aircraft could appear without warning. So the submarine continued drifting deeper beneath the Atlantic, conserving battery power while putting distance between itself and the attack zone. Finally, the commander nodded. "Prepare to surface." At 17:28 hours, compressed air pushed through the ballast tanks. The submarine began rising slowly toward the surface. Water pressure eased gradually as the depth gauge climbed, 80 meters, 60, 40. Inside the boat, the crew moved quietly to their positions. The commander waited until the final moment. Periscope depth. The narrow optical tube lifted carefully above the surface. He scanned the horizon. Empty ocean. No aircraft. No ships. Surface. A moment later, the submarine broke through the water again. The hatch opened and fresh Atlantic air rushed into the boat. Sailors climbed onto the narrow deck cautiously, scanning the sky in every direction. The patrol aircraft was gone, but the calm ocean no longer felt safe. Before the attack, the submarine commander had believed the ocean itself offered protection. Running just below the surface often hid submarines from distant ships and radar. But aircraft changed that equation. From above, sunlight could reveal shapes hidden beneath the water. The shadow that the aircraft crew had seen was enough. 4 depth charges had turned a peaceful afternoon into a violent underwater battle. And even though the submarine survived, the lesson remained clear. The Atlantic was no longer just a battlefield of ships and submarines. Now the sky watched the water. The aircraft crew would later report their attack in simple terms. Submerged contact observed beneath surface, depth charges released. To them, the encounter lasted only minutes. But for the submarine below, those minutes had nearly been fatal. Anti-submarine warfare in 1943 increasingly depended on small discoveries like this. A faint radar return, a periscope wake, or simply a shadow beneath the water. Each small clue could trigger an attack that forced submarines deep, disrupted patrol routes, and sometimes destroyed entire crews. The aircraft had not sunk the submarine that afternoon, but it had proven something equally important. Submarines could no longer assume they were invisible beneath shallow water. The submarine believed it was hidden. It had submerged just below the surface, moving slowly through the Atlantic in clear daylight. From ships on the horizon, it would have been almost impossible to see. But the patrol aircraft had a different perspective. From above, the ocean became transparent. Sunlight revealed a faint shadow sliding through the water. That single shadow triggered the attack. Within seconds, depth charges were falling from the sky. Explosions turned the calm sea into chaos, forcing the submarine deep and shaking the crew inside their steel hull. The submarine survived, but the encounter demonstrated how dramatically the Atlantic War had changed. The ocean was no longer a shield, because now the sky could see through it. And sometimes all it took to start a battle was a shadow moving beneath the waves.